There's a phone call Billy Crystal still remembers clearly, even decades later. Not because of what was said, but because of who was on the other end, and who he pretended to be. For years, Robin Williams would ring Crystal's house, skip the hello, and simply start talking as somebody else entirely. A half-invented Soviet defector, a fussy backstage assistant named Gary, a version of Ronald Reagan that existed nowhere but inside his own head. Crystal would pick up, and the two of them would stay in character for the length of the call, sometimes never breaking, never once speaking as themselves. That habit is one of the realest windows anyone has into what these two men actually meant to each other. Not the tabloid version. Not the highlight reel. The version Crystal has spent the last decade slowly explaining, one interview at a time, to try to make people understand what he lost. This is that story, told through what Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg, and the people who knew Robin Williams best have actually said on the record. Billy Crystal and Robin Williams met in the late 1970s on the Los Angeles stand-up circuit, at a moment when comedy itself was changing shape. The old joke and punchline format was giving way to something looser and more dangerous. Comedians who improvised, who took risks in front of a live room instead of running rehearsed material. Williams, even in his earliest club sets, was already something audiences hadn't seen before. A performer who could shift through a dozen voices in the space of a single bit, following his own mind wherever it jumped next. Crystal watched that chaos and did something unusual. He leaned into it instead of trying to compete with it. Over the years that followed, the two developed what friends and collaborators would later call a genuine creative partnership, not a rivalry. Crystal often described his role as the anchor to Williams' storm, precise, controlled, built to let Robin's improvisation have somewhere to land. That dynamic became the foundation of a friendship that would run for nearly 4 decades, through hit movies, charity telethons, award shows, and, eventually, a private medical crisis that neither man discussed publicly while Williams was alive. The detail Crystal keeps returning to, in interview after interview, is the phone calls. Speaking with Whoopi Goldberg on The View not long after Williams' death, Crystal described what those calls actually felt like from the inside. Site index equals 2-1. He said the two of them talked about the calls like jazz musicians riffing late into the night, going for hours without ever speaking as themselves. /site, it wasn't a bit they performed for an audience. Nobody else was on the line. It was just something Robin needed to do, and something Billy was willing to sit through, night after night, for years. Crystal has told a related story in multiple settings, including that same interview, about the two of them essentially co-hosting the Academy Awards from a distance whenever Whoopi Goldberg was the one on stage. Site index equals 3-1. Crystal recalled that whenever Goldberg hosted the Oscars from Los Angeles, the phone would ring the moment she started her opening monologue, and it would be Williams checking in from San Francisco, wanting to know how their friend was doing. /site, the three of them would then effectively watch the broadcast together, 300 miles apart, cracking jokes and offering support in real time. It's a small detail, but it says something bigger. These weren't performers competing for spotlight. They were, by Crystal's own account, protective of each other in a business built on the opposite instinct. The most vivid documentation of this habit came later, in the 2018 HBO documentary Robin Williams, Come Inside My Mind. Crystal appears in the film describing how a missed call from Williams was something to look forward to rather than dread. Site index equals 6-1. He recalled recognizing the 415 area code on his phone and knowing instantly it was Robin, and that whatever was coming was going to be something good. /site, sometimes it wasn't even a live call. Williams would leave voicemails built entirely around a new invented character, just to make Crystal laugh when he woke up. Documentary director Marina Zenovich, who interviewed dozens of people close to Williams for the project, said afterward that Crystal's segment stood out to her as the most emotionally raw sit-down in the entire film. She described sensing, in his account, a man who had genuinely believed he and Williams would grow old together, and now had to sit with the fact that they wouldn't. None of this was a nightly 2 a.m. ritual dreamed up for a video script. It was, by Crystal's own repeated description, an ongoing habit of comfort and connection between two men who had found, in each other, one of the only people who understood exactly what their specific, strange kind of fame actually felt like. The friendship found its most public expression in Comic Relief USA, the charity telethon founded in 1986 by producer Bob Zmuda, with Crystal, Williams, and Whoopi Goldberg serving as the show's anchoring hosts. The telecasts, aired on HBO across the late 80s and 90s, were built around a genuinely serious goal: raising money for medical care and services for homeless Americans, at a time when that issue rarely got sustained attention on mainstream television. Crystal has said in multiple interviews, including a 2021 conversation with Collider, that the trio's efforts across those telethons raised roughly $70 million over the years for homelessness-related causes, a figure that reflects both the show's popularity and the audience's willingness to respond to comedy paired with a real cause. Other retrospective accounts of the partnership have put the number closer to 50 million. Either way, it was a genuinely significant sum raised almost entirely through unscripted, improvised segments built on the fly by three comedians who trusted each other completely on live television. That trust mattered because the format demanded it. The comic relief broadcasts were loosely structured by design, leaving long stretches of airtime for Crystal, Williams, and Goldberg to fill with whatever came to mind. When something went wrong technically, or a segment ran short, the three of them were expected to simply generate material out of nothing live, in front of a national audience. It's the kind of pressure that either destroys an on-air partnership or cements it. For these three, it clearly did the latter. Of everything the trio did together, one moment has outlived all the others in the retelling, largely because Crystal chose to bring it up himself, years later, at the worst possible moment: Robin Williams Memorial. During a comic relief fundraising day at a New York Mets game at Shea Stadium, Crystal, Williams, and Goldberg ended up in the broadcast booth alongside legendary sportscaster Tim McCarver. Site index equals 14-1, Crystal has recounted that Robin knew essentially nothing about baseball going into the segment. /site, what followed was pure, unscripted comic invention. Williams built an entire bit out of his own ignorance of the sport, riffing his way through the broadcast as only he could, turning a total lack of baseball knowledge into one of the more memorable moments of the entire telethon run. Crystal liked the story enough, and it captured something true enough about who Williams was as a performer, that he chose to retell it publicly 2 weeks after Williams' death, during his tribute at the 2014 Primetime Emmy Awards. That he reached for a light-hearted baseball booth memory, rather than something more solemn, in the middle of a national eulogy tells you a great deal about what Crystal actually wanted people to remember. Not a tragedy, but a friend who could make an entire stadium broadcast funnier just by walking into the room. In 1997, Crystal and Williams finally got the vehicle they'd apparently wanted for years, a film built specifically around their pairing. Ivan Reitman's comedy Father's Day cast the two as very different men who team up to track down a teenage boy who might be the son of either one of them. The film itself received a mixed critical reception, but the partnership behind the camera became part of its legacy anyway. Reitman shot with a multi-camera setup specifically to capture Crystal and Williams' improvisational chemistry, rather than locking the production to a rigid script, and crew members frequently described takes dissolving into genuine, unscripted back and forth between the two leads. Photographs from the set, some later shared publicly by Crystal himself, show both men doubled over laughing between takes, the kind of image that doesn't require much explanation. It wasn't the last time they'd share a screen. The two also appeared together in a memorable episode of Mork and Mindy decades earlier, when Crystal made a guest appearance during Williams' original star-making sitcom run, a full-circle detail that underscores just how long this creative relationship actually spanned, from the very start of Williams' television career to one of the final co-starring films either of them made together. For most of their friendship, the public only saw the version of Robin Williams built for the stage and screen, endlessly quick, endlessly generous with his energy, seemingly inexhaustible. What almost nobody outside his closest circle knew was that, in his final years, Williams was fighting something his own doctors couldn't correctly identify while he was alive. In May 2014, roughly 3 months before his death, Williams was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. It wasn't until his autopsy that the real picture emerged. His widow, Susan Schneider Williams, later wrote about that discovery in a 2016 editorial for the medical journal Neurology, describing how doctors ultimately determined her husband had actually been suffering from diffuse Lewy body dementia, a severe, progressive brain disease that shares symptoms with Parkinson's but attacks the brain far more broadly. Site index equals 27-1, she wrote that Williams had lost roughly 40% of his dopamine neurons, and that almost no region of his brain and brainstem was free of the abnormal protein deposits that define the disease. Site multiple physicians who reviewed the case afterward told her it was among the most severe presentations of the condition they had ever seen. Schneider Williams has since become a prominent advocate for Lewy body dementia awareness, serving on the board of the American Brain Foundation and pushing for research funding aimed at making the disease detectable in living patients rather than only through autopsy, the exact gap that left her husband's doctors chasing the wrong diagnosis for months. She has been careful to note publicly that his death shouldn't be attributed to depression alone. The disease itself, she's explained, produced overwhelming anxiety, paranoia, and a growing awareness in Williams that his own mind was failing him in ways he couldn't control or explain. Crystal has said publicly, including in a 2014 Today Show interview with Matt Lauer, that he and Williams spoke constantly during that period, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. He's acknowledged he was aware his friend was struggling, without necessarily having the full medical picture anyone would only get after Williams' death. What he has consistently emphasized in the years since is how much energy it clearly took Williams to maintain the public version of himself right up to the end. Williams' own son, Zach, has since offered a rare inside view of that same period. In a 2021 conversation on the Genius Life podcast, Zach described watching his father grow increasingly frustrated in the months after the Parkinson's diagnosis, because what he was experiencing didn't line up neatly with what other Parkinson's patients described. Zach recalled his father struggling with focus and with a sense that something was wrong that the diagnosis didn't fully explain, and said he wanted to be present for his father daily during that stretch, precisely because he could tell how isolating the confusion had become, even surrounded by family who loved him. That isolation is really the through line connecting Crystal's account and the Williams family's account. Everyone close to Robin Williams sensed something was different in his final year, without anyone, including his own doctors, being able to name it correctly until it was too late to matter. Robin Williams' death didn't just leave a gap in Billy Crystal's life. It reshaped the lives of his own children, and in the years since, both Zach Williams and his sister Zelda have spoken publicly, and often with striking candor, about what that loss actually did to them. Zach Williams has said in several interviews, including a 2019 conversation with the peer support community 18%, that he was left very traumatized by his father's death and spent a period afterwards self-medicating with alcohol before eventually finding healing through service work and, later, through becoming a mental health advocate himself. He has since founded PYM, a company focused on stress and anxiety relief, and serves in advocacy roles with organizations including Bring Change to Mind and United for Global Mental Health. In a 2021 CBS News interview, Zach revealed he was ultimately diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder in the aftermath of his father's death and worked through a 12-step program and group therapy to process it. He's also spoken about naming his own son McLaurin, after his father's middle name, as a quiet way of carrying Robin forward. There's a certain symmetry to it. Crystal spent years being publicly careful and protective around the private, painful parts of his friend's decline, while Robin's own son eventually chose the opposite approach, deciding that being open about his father's death, and his own resulting struggles, was the thing that actually helped him heal. Both instincts, protection, and openness seem to come from the same place, a refusal to let what happened to Robin Williams simply disappear into tabloid shorthand about a comedian who battled depression. The reality, as his widow's medical writing and his son's advocacy work both make clear, was more specific, more medical, and more complicated than that. On August 25, 2014, 2 weeks after Williams' death on August 11th, Crystal stood on the stage of the primetime Emmy Awards to deliver the show's tribute to his friend. He later called it, in an NBC Today interview, the hardest thing he'd ever had to do professionally, made harder by how little time had passed. The speech itself is now one of the more quoted eulogies in recent entertainment history. Crystal opened by insisting it was still difficult to speak of Williams in the past tense, because he'd been so present in all of their lives for so long. He ran through the sheer range of places he'd watched his friend make people laugh: television, film, nightclubs, arenas, military hospitals overseas, and in one story he told, the living room of a dying girl fulfilling a final wish. He called Williams, simply, the brightest star in the comedy galaxy. Then he closed with an image he'd clearly built with care, comparing Williams to a star whose light keeps traveling toward Earth long after the star itself has burned out, meaning the glow people still feel from his work isn't an illusion, it's real light, still arriving. Crystal ended the tribute with a phrase pulled from Williams' own early career, one the comedian used to describe practically anything that delighted him. Robin Williams. What a concept. The theater, by every account of that night, went completely silent. The friendship didn't end with the eulogy, even if the calls did. In the years since, Crystal has continued talking about Williams in interviews, documentaries, and public tributes, not out of obligation, but seemingly because he's still working through what the loss actually meant. In a 2018 interview tied to the release of Come Inside My Mind, he described their dynamic in a way that captures the whole relationship in a single line. Williams always looked to him to bring things back to earth, and it took Crystal years to learn how to hold his own in that exchange, to trade blows, as he put it, with a performer operating on an entirely different frequency. That's really the through line across 4 decades of interviews, documentaries, and one unforgettable Emmy stage. A friendship that started as 2 young comics recognizing something rare in each other, and ended as one of them standing in front of 17 million television viewers, trying to find the right words for a person who'd spent his whole life finding them for everyone else. Robin Williams has been gone for over a decade now. Billy Crystal is still talking about him, carefully, honestly, and clearly still working out how to say goodbye to somebody who never really stopped being present in his life. What's striking, looking back across everything Crystal, Goldberg, and the Williams family have actually said on the record, is how little of it resembles the usual Hollywood friendship story. There's no feud, no falling out, no competing egos angling for the bigger laugh. Just 2 comics from the same scrappy 1970s club circuit who happened to recognize something rare in each other early on, and who spent the next 4 decades protecting that recognition, through hit telethons, a baseball booth at Shea Stadium, a movie built around their chemistry, and, eventually, phone calls that Crystal still describes like a shared piece of music neither one of them ever wanted to stop playing. It's worth remembering, too, that the story didn't end with Crystal's Emmy speech. It kept unfolding in Susan Schneider Williams' medical advocacy, in Zach Williams' openness about his own mental health, and in Crystal's continued willingness, even now, to keep bringing his friend up in interviews rather than letting the memory go quiet. Grief like that doesn't really resolve. It just finds new places to live. So maybe the real question isn't whether Hollywood still produces friendships like this one. Maybe it's whether we, as an audience, still know how to recognize one when we see it, because by every account available, this wasn't a friendship built for the cameras at all. The cameras just happened to catch pieces of it along the way. This script draws on statements Billy Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg, and Susan Schneider Williams have made in verifiable interviews, documentaries, and published writing, including ABC News coverage of The View, the HBO documentary Robin Williams, Come Inside My Mind, Susan Schneider Williams' 2016 essay in the journal Neurology, and contemporaneous news coverage of the 2014 Emmy Awards tribute.